Behind every wedding is a story. You see the wedding, the dress, the flowers, the vows, sometimes even the photos. But what you don't see are the details that made that moment happen. Behind every ceremony is an arch of family expectations, societal pressures, and cultural shifts that shape not just the couple, but the legacy they hope to build. The historic Black weddings of Senator Blanche K. and Josephine Willson, Nat King Cole and Maria Ellington, Ida B. Wells and Ferdinand Barnett, Cullen and Yolande Bois, and Mae Walker and Dr. Gordon H. Jackson were more than just celebrations. They were reflections of power, love, and the complicated dance between personal choice and public expectation. And soon, Welcome to another episode of I'll Tell You What, the podcast that's all love Black history. I'm Ashley, your favorite raconteuse that shares these stories with you every single Monday. Thank you for watching on the tube of you and listening wherever you get your podcast. If you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and do so, and make sure you turn those notifications on. And it's giveaway time, y'all, so you're going to want to make sure that you're following I'll Tell You What everywhere you can to see, one, what prize you can enter to win, and two, how to do so. So with that being said, let's get started with a wedding that took place back in 1878. He was a senator, and she was a member of the Black elite. Their wedding positioned them as an it couple to both blacks and whites across the nation. And yet, that's not exactly how their families felt. Senator Blanche K. was the first African American to serve a full term in the United States Senate. Born to an enslaved mother and her enslaver, he surpassed expectations and became a landowner and politician. The woman that would become his wife grew up in a completely different environment. Josephine Washington grew up in a privileged household. Her father was a successful black dentist in Philadelphia that moved his family to Cleveland because it was, quote, known for its upper class black population, and its black community benefited from integrated schools which invested more in black children. Blanche met the Wilsons in 1876, likely after the time his first fiancée passed away. When in town, he'd see the Wilsons, which biographer Lawrence Otis Graham wrote that they, quote, were surely flattered by the fact that they were hosting such a prominent man. Through that time in Cleveland, Blanche and Josephine showed interest in one another, and eventually they'd maintain a relationship through letters. This would eventually lead to an engagement, which meant wedding planning would be taken over by the Wilson family naturally. On June 24th, 1878 at 7:30 p.m. on the dot, in the freshly painted parlor at the home of Dr. and Mrs. Joseph Wilson, Blanche and Josephine got married. Josephine wore a white silk wedding dress with a ball gown silhouette. The Cleveland Gazette described her gown as, quote, covered with satin orange blossoms, and her veil, quote, reaching the floor like a cloud. You probably guessed that since the wedding was at the family home in Cleveland, that there weren't many guests. They had about 60 total, and who was, or rather wasn't in attendance was surprising for some. For one, it was noted that despite Blanche's ascent into politics and appeal amongst black and white voters, none of his political colleagues were invited to the wedding. That isn't a surprise to me. I mean, weddings are expensive and, in my opinion, should be intimate affairs. And just because we work together and might kiki a little bit from time to time doesn't necessarily mean that you are deserving of an invitation. But truthfully, maybe Blanche didn't invite any of his colleagues because of the family he was marrying into. Though Dr. and Mrs. Wilson were fine with seeing Blanche from time to time back when he would come into the Cleveland area, that likely changed when he was courting their daughter. Despite all of his accolades and accomplishments, they thought he's not like us. Dr. Willson wrote a book about the black upper class called Sketches of the Higher Classes Among the Colored Society in Philadelphia, to show white people that not all black people were lower class and not all black people were the same. Also, they preferred to segregate themselves from others that didn't share the same socioeconomic status that they had. Glam wrote, quote, "They did not socialize with people who had less money than they did or who were much darker than they were." It was also speculated that the Wilsons looked at Blanche not in a favorable light because he was slightly darker than they were. Colorism, I swear. But because their complexions were lighter and, of course, closer to passing, they felt that possibly any children that they would have in the future might have a rougher time in life just because of the color of their skin. But again, this is just speculation. There was also an assumption that the Wilsons might be skeptical of Blanche's association with them. Like, did they think he was aligning himself with them to further his own brand? That doesn't really make too much sense to me, but could have been a reason why he did not invite any of his colleagues to the wedding, nor discuss the wedding beforehand either. Another group of people that did not attend his wedding were his relatives. His brothers found out about the wedding in the news like the rest of the world. The reason why he didn't invite them, even though he was closest to some, was never fully revealed. It was speculated that he was trying to distance himself from his enslaved past, or, quote, because he believed that they would reflect negatively on him, despite some of his siblings going on to have respectfully successful careers themselves. Maybe compounded with the sentiments of his in-laws, who grew to warm up to him closer to the wedding. He just felt it would be better if they weren't present. Ultimately, their marriage propelled them into a new level of celebrity. The media covered them heavily afterwards, including their 4-month-long honeymoon in Europe. And after their wedding, Blanche continued his political career, later serving as the Register of the U.S. Treasury, making him the first black man whose signature appeared on U.S. currency. Josephine became a very respected educator and activist, working with the National Association of Colored Women and advocating for black women's education and social advancement. Together, they had a child while also navigating Washington society, and because of their status in that time, their union was documented as one of the first notable black legacies to occur in time. Now let's turn to another couple with a very notable wedding as well. We know of Nat King Cole and his marriage to Maria, but do you know what all went wrong around their wedding? On Easter Sunday, March 28th, 1948, Nathaniel Adams Coles, known to everyone as Nat King Cole, and Maria Hawkins Ellington exchanged vows in a lavish and large Harlem ceremony. According to HarlemWorld.com, the wedding took place at the historic Abyssinian Baptist Church, officiated by the one and only Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Maria, a jazz singer who previously worked with Duke Ellington, no relation, wore a light blue satin gown designed by Harlem's own Zelda Wynn Valdez. This dress cost $700, which today would be around $9,300. The gown featured an off-the-shoulder design with, quote, a wide white beaded shawl collar, complemented by, quote, a coronet of seeded pearls affixed to her veil. Nat King Cole stood beside her, quote, in a dark cutaway coat and striped gray trousers, a wing collar with a natty dove gray ascot. The church was adorned with orange blossoms and Easter lilies, which spoke of the decor of the time. The ceremony was attended by hundreds that piled into the church, and for those that didn't, they were lined up outside. Some sources speculated nearly 3,000 guests were present, including Reverend Powell's wife and entertainer Hazel Scott, Sarah Vaughan, Dizzy Gillespie, Buddy Rich, Billy Strayhorn, and Leonard Feather. Their wedding reception consisted of 600 guests, and boy, did they eat well. They had, according to HarlemWorld.com, quote, 75 pounds of coleslaw, 18 turkeys, 20 hams, 18 rib roasts, and 197 bottles of champagne and spirits. And they had a 5-layer wedding cake. But as I mentioned to you all many, many times before, there's always something that will go wrong around your wedding day. There's nothing you can do about it. For one, they wanted to have the wedding at the Waldorf Astoria, but the Waldorf Astoria did not allow Black people to have weddings at their hotels. So they pivoted to the Belmont Plaza instead for their reception. Another element was that some of the most important people to them were not present that day. Nat's father, Reverend Edward Coles, was not there because the wedding took place on Easter Sunday, and as a pastor, he could not attend. But more notable than that, Maria's aunt, Charlotte Hawkins Brown, who was the woman that raised her, protested the marriage. She did not believe that Nat was appropriate for Maria. She said they were, quote, unequally yoked. Some assumed Charlotte's feelings towards Nat was actually due to the fact that Maria was a light-skinned woman and Nat was a dark-skinned man. Again, colorism. It also could have been because Nat and Maria's relationship began while he was still married to his first wife, Nadine. Who knows? Either way, I'm sure Maria was hurt that someone she considered a mom to her wasn't there for her on one of the biggest days of her life. Despite the societal challenges and familial objections they faced, Nat and Maria Cole remained married for nearly 2 decades, producing 5 children, including singer Natalie Cole. And while their wedding was absolutely gorgeous, this is just another example of the outsiders not necessarily knowing all the pain that probably came along with it. Now let's move on to the wedding of Ida B. Wells Barnett and her husband, Ferdinand. Imagine postponing your wedding not once, not twice, but 3 times. And not because you had cold feet, but because you were too busy taking on white supremacy. That was the reality for Ida B. Wells and Ferdinand Barnett. So according to their great-granddaughter, Michelle Duster, Ida B. Wells and Ferdinand Barnett likely met in 1893. Ferdinand reached out to Ida to help write a pamphlet about the exclusion of Black Americans at the World's Columbian Exposition, which was this huge economic fair in Chicago. Ferdinand, if you were wondering, was an attorney, educator, business owner, writer, and activist who was also a single father of 2 as his first wife passed away in 1890. And y'all know Ida, a journalist, editor, business owner, educator, and overall one of my favorite people in history. When she met Ferdinand, she dated some guys here or there, but none of them were really worth a darn. So by meeting Ferdinand, she was finally meeting her equal. But getting married took a little bit of work. It wasn't because they didn't feel strongly about each other, but doing the work comes first. Ida wrote in her autobiography, quote, 3 different dates had been set for the wedding, and every time a call had come to go someplace to deliver an address. Then Ida was speaking out against lynching and would get a request frequently to go to some local community and speak to the leaders. So she had to push the wedding off again and again and again. But Ferdinand didn't mind too much, like a real man shouldn't. Eventually, on June 27th, 1895 at 8 p.m., Ida and Ferdinand got married at Bethel Church. Ida wore a gown, quote, white satin on train, trimmed with chiffon and orange blossoms. Her bridesmaids were her little sisters, Annie and Lily. The wedding was officiated by Reverend D.A. Graham, the pastor of Bethel. The wedding reception was held in the parlor of the home she had been staying in while in Chicago. The New York Age wrote, quote, here, the bridal party received the congratulations of hundreds of friends and many strangers from different parts of the country who had come to the city to attend the wedding. Ida wrote that she originally wanted a church wedding, but because her elders had passed away, this wasn't possible. The members of the Ida B. Wells Club asked to throw a reception, to which she obliged. However, if I read this correctly, because some learned that she was getting married, which I guess limited her availability briefly, she wrote, quote, they seemed to feel that I had deserted the cause, and some of them censured me rather severely in their newspapers for having done so. The women that knew better got together and protested that sentiment. Truthfully, it reminded me of how some women, even now, feel that Kamala Harris needs to be doing more in 2025. When are we missing something? What is everybody's issue with Black women that just want and deserve rest and leisure. Why is it that we gotta do everything? Anyway, Ida and Ferdinand were a powerful couple. It was noted that they balanced their domestic workload and cared for their children equally. And she hyphenated her last name, which were several signs of a true progressive marriage, something you just did not see in the 1800s. Now, I know you remember this next story, but I can't wait to tell you about it anyway. Yolande Bois and Countee Cullen should have never gotten married. On April 9th, 1928, Harlem's elite gathered for what should have been the wedding of the decade. The bride, Yolande Bois, daughter of W.E.B. Du Bois, walked down the aisle at Salem Methodist Episcopal Church in Harlem. Her groom, Countee Cullen, was a known poet of the Harlem Renaissance. His father, Reverend Frederick A. Cullen, officiated the wedding. Together, they had over 25 bridesmaids and groomsmen in their wedding party, including his best friend Harold Jackman and good friend Langston Hughes. Over 3,000 or 4,000 people attended the ceremony. It was a union that truly symbolized Black ambition and prestige. It was described in The Crisis by W.E.B. Du Bois as, quote, the symbolic march of young and Black America. But behind the grandeur, there were cracks in the foundation. Cracks that would soon shatter their marriage. Now, what are the cracks, you may wonder? Well, there were so many. Where do we start? For one, they didn't like each other. I mean, they weren't really interested in each other initially. Yolande was actually interested in a saxophonist named Jimmy Lunsford, but W.E.B. did not approve. Meanwhile, Countee said she was ugly. Okay, he didn't say that exactly, but he wrote to Harold, quote, no, she is not beautiful, but one is drawn to her by some indefinable magnetism of refinement and soulful honesty. Basically, he was saying he don't know why he liked this girl, but it's not because she's cute. He was drawn to her anyway and kept writing her through the years after meeting her in 1923. The second reason was Countee was inconsistent in his feelings. In writing to Harold and other friend Alan Locke, he'd introduce other women that captivated his interest. He told Harold, quote, I sincerely believe I'm really in love at last, alluding to Fiona Braithwaite, yet he was still exchanging letters with Yolande. And then he was also entertaining a woman named Sidonia Burt then, too. And he was maintaining a friendship with a woman named Ruth Marie Thomas, who might have had a crush on him, or at least was upset that she learned that he was engaged, but not through him. The third reason was that their parents were way too involved, and it kind of felt like an arranged marriage. In the biography In Bid Him Sing by Charles Molesworth, he wrote that there was, quote, pressure from both parents to get engaged because of what that could mean for not only the culture but the community. W.E.B. was thrilled at the prospect of Countee becoming his son-in-law by even helping him win a Guggenheim Fellowship. He also was heavily involved in the planning process of the wedding and shelled out $1,500 for it, which today would be around $30,000. But perhaps the biggest reason why their marriage failed was revealed during what many assume was their honeymoon. So the rumor is that after their wedding, Countee honeymooned not with his wife, but with his best friend in Europe. The reality was that Yolande had to finish teaching and couldn't immediately join Countee in Europe during his fellowship until later in the fall. When she arrived, she, quote, became quite ill and spent quite some time in the hospital. By the time she was in Paris, Harold had actually returned to New York, but he would always be very honest with his best friend and tell him that this marriage wasn't going to last. And, well, eventually, yeah. Yolande was constantly in and out of the hospital in Europe, but when they were together, Countee would find ways to get away. He didn't want to be around her. The crumbling of their marriage led them to engage in communications with W.B. Du Bois. In the letter that he wrote to his daughter, letter, he basically told her that newlywed life is new for her, but she should do everything she can to, quote, make it easy for Countee. And she, quote, should not distract him or make him spend too much catering to her. One line I particularly found interesting and truthfully might define how I see W.E.B. Du Bois was when he told Yolande, quote, stop thinking about yourself or being sorry for yourself or regarding the world as revolving around you and concentrate on the main job of having Countee Cullen. Basically, be a good little wife and let your very important husband do his job while you give him whatever he needs. And I mean, whatever he needs. In his letters to Countee, he echoed the sentiment of having a brat for a daughter. He wrote, quote, Yolande does not know what she wants or loves or hopes for. If perhaps you could just bear with her and try again, perhaps all would yet be well. His letters also revealed a bigger issue, which was the lack of a satisfied sex life. Yes, they were discussing their sex life with W.E.B., who had opinions on this. He told Countee that Yolande wasn't experienced and women usually don't care for sex at first. He mentioned a relative who, quote, married a manly young fellow. She confessed recently that she cried every time he touched her for a year. He basically pleaded with Countee to try again, and over time, intimacy would be enjoyable to both of them. Likely when W.E.B. was trading letters with Countee, he wasn't aware of why his sex life was so horrible. But by the following spring, Countee had a heart-to-heart with Yolande, which led her to admit to her father the reason for their disintegrating marriage. Quote, I knew something was wrong physically, but being very ignorant and inexperienced, I couldn't be sure what. When he confessed things he'd always known, that he was abnormal sexually as far as other men were concerned, then many things became clear. So Countee came out to Yolande. This revelation wasn't a surprise or news to those closest to him. Harold knew, Alan knew, Sten even knew. He gifted them a fruit bowl as a wedding gift because he's essentially a big old messy boots. But perhaps being the adopted son of a pastor and being placed into the spotlight made him suppress the feelings that came so naturally to him. To not embarrass either of them, they held off on filing for a divorce until summer of 1929. And it would be granted that December. W.E.B. kept in touch with Countee, telling him, quote, you have my sympathy and love, my dear boy. So what should have been a historic love story became an example of what happens when societal expectations and the weight of legacy outweighs being true to yourself and the people you love. What some saw as the first Black glam wedding was really a business decision. On November 24th, 1923, Harlem witnessed a wedding so extravagant it made it to the New York Times. Mae Walker, granddaughter of Madam C.J. Walker, married Dr. Gordon H. Jackson, quote, the grandson of a Cincinnati coal dealer who had been one of the 19th century's wealthiest Black businessmen, according to Mae's granddaughter, Alelia Bundles. The wedding was a spectacle, and it started 8 days before with a daily event. There was a bridal shower, a luncheon, a party, a pre-wedding dance, a special screening of a new Broadway musical called Runnin' Wild, a bachelor party, and the rehearsal dinner. On her wedding day, the New York Times described what Mae wore as a, quote, gown of chiffon beaded with seed pearls over bride satin, tulle veil attached to Egyptian pearl headgear and caught with orange blossoms, designed and made by Mrs. Pearl Crawford Craft of Philadelphia. All of the clothes worn by the bride, bridesmaids, and flower girls were made by Black designers. The wedding party consisted of children of the Black elite. The guests consisted of the Black elite, and then some. They came dressed to the nines, y'all. They wore, quote, mink coats, squirrel coats, ermine coats, a fashion parade of fur. They pulled up in, quote, limousines, touring cars, and taxis. Nobody came on foot. And because we have such a prestigious guest list, we need to be protected. There were 26 police officers there, and this wedding cost $42,000. Which by today's standards would be $1 million. And a big part of that was because 9,000 invitations were sent out. Now the Times said there were 500 guests inside the church and 2,000 guests outside the church. 1,000 of the invitations went to the people in Mae's mama's address book, but outside of that, the other 8,000 went to, quote, supply stations to reach the 40,000 agents of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company. I read that to mean, say Mary Kay's grandbaby was getting married and your mama is a Mary Kay lady. She's getting an invitation to the wedding. Not only that, the drama and extraness of this whole event was seen as a way to get advertising for the company. Bundles wrote on her website that an executive of the Walker Manufacturing Company said, quote, while its purpose certainly is not for the advertising, God knows we are getting $50,000 worth of publicity. Everything has its compensation. She also noted that her great-grandmama orchestrated the wedding, quote, with an eye towards a Walker heir. So while this was probably the most epic wedding Harlem has seen and will be cemented as a legendary wedding throughout Black history, the marriage didn't last. Mae and Gordon divorced in 1926. Man, what a wedding it was anyway. So there's always more to the wedding than what meets the eye, and that was the case for these legends of Black history. Now let's start with Blanche K. Bruce and Josephine Willson Bruce in 1878. Blanche was the first Black man to serve a full term in the U.S. Senate, but Josephine's elite Black family wasn't impressed. His political colleagues weren't invited to the wedding, neither was his own family. Their marriage made waves and helped position them as a DC it couple, despite facing scrutiny from both Blacks and whites. Then there's Nat King Cole and Maria Hawkins Ellington Cole in their 1948 wedding. It was full of the who's who in music and entertainment, but racism forced them to relocate their reception because the Waldorf Astoria didn't allow Black people to get married there. And Maria's auntie, who basically raised her, boycotted the wedding completely, believing that they were, quote, unequally yoked, though it was speculated that colorism was largely at play as well. Postponing your wedding not one, not two, but 3 times. And not because of cold feet, but because you're too busy doing the work. That's what happened to Ida B. Wells and Ferdinand Barnett in 1895. And y'all remember Yolande Bois and County Cullen's 1928 wedding, child. It was supposed to be the start of a legacy, but they shouldn't have even gotten married to begin with. They were pressured by their family and Black society at large, but ultimately Countee ended up coming out to Yolande and revealed that he was attracted to men. And let's remember Mae Walker's 1923 wedding, one of the first Black glam weddings, but also a business move. As Madam C.J. Walker's granddaughter, Mae's wedding to Dr. Gordon Jackson was an extravagant event with 9,000 invitations sent out over a week of pre-wedding events, a 26-officer security detail, and a $42,000 price tag. It was as much about branding the Walker Empire. It was as much about branding the Walker Empire as it was about love. And it worked. The wedding made headlines. For the marriage, it was over by 1926. So the stories behind these weddings should remind us all that every road to marriage is filled with family expectations, societal pressures, and choices that echo beyond the wedding day. But I know you know this. And with that, Aisle Runners, concludes this episode of I'll Tell You What. You're going to want to make sure to subscribe, follow, share, leave a review wherever you get your podcasts, even if you watch the episodes, and join us on Patreon, and definitely come back next week for another episode and love Black history. See you in the pews.